Button's been pressed.
Yeah, Joe, good to see you.
Hi, Stefan, Dave. Nice to meet you, or at least in person. Hey, Joe. Good. Come on.
All right.
It's not gonna go well, so I will just skip that. We're gonna spend the half the panel doing that.
Okay, folks. So I think we're ready to get started. Yeah, let's do it. This is our second meeting in a three-part series on AI. Our first was back on October 12th, and we had the really far-ranging discussion about AI and society. We had, I think we had a great time, a really productive conversation. I think the highlight for me was when Lou Zhang, one of our panelists from computer science, was asked by me, hey, can you tell us something hopeful about AI, what you're hoping for? This is the end of our conversation. He said, you know what, I don't really have any hopes, I just have a list of concerns. And so we moved through that list. But there were some really strong notes of hope in that conversation as well. So I hope we have a balance here today in our second meeting, which is now focusing on storytelling. We're really excited about this subject. And I just want to point real quick to the next and the third and final part of this series, which is going to be on Thursday, November 30th from 11 to 12:30. And then the topic is going to be AI and teaching, AI in the classroom. I'll be one of the panelists talking about the course I'm teaching right now, Intro to the Digital Humanities. My name is Curtis Mon, by the way, the director of this space. Yeah, I'm teaching a course on, it's called Introduction to the Digital Humanities. I've been looking at AI all semester, but our other panelists include Maggie Fernandez from English. She's teaching a course on the intersection between writing and AI. We'll also have Ken Musick here from Global Campus, and he'll give us a nice overview of education and AI. Guillermo Popo-Burnett, or one of our PhD candidates from Complet in Cultural Studies and a Spanish TA. He'll be talking about how he uses ChatGPT as a Spanish tutor in his Spanish language courses. So that'll be a fun conversation. That's on November 30th. I also want to draw your attention to a special event we have upcoming this Monday, October 30th from 12 to 1:30. That's with Professor Clorinda Donato from CSU Long Beach. And she's going to be talking to us about computer-assisted translation, DH tools for language learning. And she'll be talking specifically about Voyant, which is one of the tools we learn in my class. So I'm really looking forward to that. I earned my MA from CSU Long Beach in German Studies, so I've worked with Clorinda. She's an amazing professor. And she's just recently got into DH, and she's going full steam ahead and teaching several courses on translation using Voyant. So that should be a really exciting conversation. That's this upcoming Monday from 12 to 1:30. So yeah, that's some of the events we have coming up soon. Please come back for the third event of this series on AI in the classroom. But let's go to today's event on AI and storytelling. Our moderator is David Fredrick. Many of you know him already. He's a classics professor, but he's also been teaching game design for a decade now, and he's been the creative lead on a whole slew of games, many of them award-winning games, educational games. And he knows how to not only technically make digital stories come to life through game engines, but he also knows how to contextualize storytelling, digital storytelling, in the broader context of storytelling generally. So I think he's the perfect person to be hosting this panel. Let's give a warm welcome to David
Thanks to our panelists for being here, and I think Greg was in Tesseract for a long time and can testify that I actually know better how to break games than to make them. And so Greg was creative lead for a long time at Tesseract and was responsible for a lot of the other products that we made. And that was certainly a super fun ride. So I'll let the panelists introduce themselves here in just a second, just an overview of how we're going to go through this. 5 or so minutes for introductions, and then we're going to go into sort of AI and storytelling at a high level, the claims that have been made about it, which will be fun to talk about. And then the next thing is going to be AI can intervene in how you make games at a number of different levels. We're going to get some of those levels and workflows within games where AI might find itself positioned to either help or potentially harm. And then the future, like where are we now, where are we headed? Because it's hard to talk about AI and not talk both about now, like what is it doing right now and where's it going? But the last part will be specifically sort of about future visions for this and what we see good, bad, ugly coming out of AI looking forward. And then at the tail end of that, not that I'm qualified to talk about it, but I think it's a very interesting idea. I think the last thing we're going to throw on the table is indigenous approaches to AI, because they're really different. And how they see AI, because obviously indigenous people storytell, right? And so in terms of our mythology and our storytelling, what is this tool? What is this approach? And it's quite a different orientation, I think, in some ways helpful. So that's a roadmap for where we're headed. We hope to have some time for questions at the end. So we'll just move from Greg to the right or to your left and have the panelists introduce themselves.
Yeah, I'll make it quick. I'm Greg Rogers. I'm the creative director and co-founder at Causeway Studios. We're a local independent game studio here in Northwest Arkansas. We're really focused on narrative-focused games. My specialization is in narrative and game design. You got to wear a lot of different hats when you're working in a small team, any team, especially when you're a startup team. But that's my main focus and my main background. We can dig into that more later if you want to, but that's what you need to know about me.
Hi, I'm Steph. It's really good to be here and see all your faces. My background is in journalism, actually. That's what I studied in school, and then I got my master's in multimedia. I spent my first 8 years of my career at Intel doing a lot of AI-based work, mainly with developers and kind of getting to know their stories, and then also being a storyteller myself for the company for our Intel Software YouTube channel. That's kind of like I don't know, qualified spokesperson. It was strange. It was fun. Anyways, and then that's before I met Joe at a conference for Web3. He was looking for a narrative writer, and then so I became, a writer for this game we're building. And it's been about a year since we started working together on this. Learned a lot, and yeah, excited to be here today.
I'm Joe. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Unlimited Studio, which is what Steph is working on with me. And my background is in user experience and design, entrepreneurship. I've been working on creating things for most of my career. Lifelong gamer, big in storytelling. And specifically what we're doing at Unlimited Studio is creating mobile games and tooling built around AI and mixed reality. So really excited to dive in here.
Okay, so it's a good panel, and we're going to jump in first with some of the stuff that gets said about AI. And this stuff comes from companies working with it, and so it's definitely in that sense biased, like they have a product to move through what they say about it. But I don't think it's that weird in terms of the claims made for AI, so I'm just going to read this. You guys have it in front of you, so thinking about responding to it. The first one is and they're eerily similar, coming from different companies, which you might think about why that's the case. So blurb from AI Content Fly. Stories have been an integral part of human culture since the dawn of time. They serve as a means of entertainment, education, and communication. From epic poems to classic novels, we have always found ways to tell stories that captivate and engage our audiences. Hard to argue with. But what if we could take storytelling to the next level? What if we could use AI to create stories that are not only compelling, but also entirely generated by machines? The potential of AI-generated content for storytelling is vast, and it's only a matter of time before we start seeing AI-generated stories becoming more prevalent in our lives. So pretty sweeping claims, and here's the next blurb from Analytics, I think it's pronounced Meet-Ups. Since time immemorial, stories have captivated our hearts and minds with storylines that elicit emotion, stimulate creativity, and reveal important messages. That's like the other first sentence with some word changes. But what if we could imagine that thanks to the power of AI, we can now go beyond the limits of human storytelling and allow AI to co-author our stories? That's probably enough of that blurb. And so you see where they're headed, and some very similar claims are being made, and I think if our goal was like AI and cheating, and these were two students, we might say, wow, that's really similar. Why don't you guys do that? But anyhow, the claims being made are something I want for us to think about and evaluate. And so without overselling its potential, what are some of the positive contributions that AI can make to story generation for non-linear media like games? Let's go with that first.
Sure. Yeah, the thing about AI, as far as I understand it, I don't use it a lot day to day. It's not in my main pipeline, it's not in my roadmap. I've played around with it, I'm aware of it. And I see it as a tool. And so in terms of the biggest thing that I've seen that AI can do is when it comes to brainstorming or to getting things out there, iterating, basically taking a bunch of spaghetti and throwing it at the wall. That can be useful because I think the main purpose practically when you're talking about AI is the purpose of it is to reduce mundane or repetitive tasks and save time for people. The problem is there's a few things in art when it comes to maybe unwrapping UVs or things like that. Even in things that may be considered mundane or repetitive, I don't see them in the way that the games that we make at Causeway. But in terms of positive things is looking at how can that be a tool to help speed up processes that have to do with generating ideas or to make someone where they can spend more time working on the highly creative, cerebral, handcrafted stuff rather than working on I gotta hit that button, I gotta do this, I gotta do that. I have other things to say, but I'll save it since we're on the positive side of things. I think that's really where the AI can be helpful, but the problematic part of it, or multifaceted, but it comes into how it's being presented, is you have the same industry maybe presenting something as a tool, and the other part of it representing it as a wholesale replacement or evolution. That's a large spectrum, and when there's not a way to regulate or delineate what even the definition of that is, for especially the layman, but even the expert coming in, you need to know what the context is, and so that's something I can go into later. But
You know, Jesse Schell memorably said, ideas are not like fine china, they're like paper cups, right? And when the idea isn't working, just throw it out. And so if AI can get you those paper cups faster, right, then that's maybe saving you some time and giving you, actually freeing up your bandwidth for evaluation of ideas rather than just like, you can get more faster and evaluate quicker.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, I'd love to talk about, from a narrative perspective, how AI has been a tool for me and a way that I think that it's been helpful. So I have a neurodivergent brain, and I have ADHD and anxiety and all the things, heavily medicated. And what I really love about AI is I have so many ideas floating in my head, and sometimes I feel like my brain can kind of take what would be fine china and make it into a paper cup. So it's nice to have AI as a way to help me discover the gaps in my own thinking. Oftentimes maybe I'll be writing a scene and then I can copy it and paste it and ask ChatGPT, hey, what did I forget or what am I overlooking here? Because I might have a blind spot. I don't think that it's just because I might have a neurodivergent brain, but I do think it helps people who maybe have those problems with cognitive stuff. So for me, it's been really helpful to help me keep on track. This is a great way to put it.
Yeah, I think maybe just building on that, the thoroughness of what gets created, I think, can be dramatically improved with AI. Speed is another one. The paper cup analogy is a good one. The way we described it is, it's like the whiteboard, right? That's when you're brainstorming, like the whiteboard is where you throw the spaghetti, and AI is really, really good at throwing spaghetti. It can be really good at things further down the pipeline too, and we can get into that a little bit, but just practically for us, when we really started leaning on AI for our game, we started taking processes and things like creating a character for the narrative that, we would sometimes spend a few days like really fleshing this character out, what's their backstory and how are they kind of affiliated, and what are the kind of plot twists and the narrative arcs in their story as it ties into things later in the game. as we started experimenting with ChatGPT and created a little Notion tool that plugged into the API, we take that process and do that same level of work, but about 10 times bigger in about 15 minutes. And so what that allows us to do now is not spend all of our cycles like generating things that, like, sure, there are noticeable differences sometimes between like AI generated and human generated, but I think that's something that we can continue to massage and improve over time. But what it really let us focus on is not just the creation of these, but like how does this all stitch together? Not only does it connect logically, but does it connect in an interesting way, and does it like serve other story ideas that we have down the line, and do we feel like it leaves us open to try things, whereas maybe if we were just focused on does point A connect to point B, it gets a little rigid. And so for us, you mentioned the kind of impact for like small indie teams, like it let us dramatically increase our output and quality when it comes to, I think, the depth of story that we're telling. And again, it comes down to how you use it. I do think it's a tool, and like any tool, it can be used as a crutch, and it can be abused, and it can be misused, and so it's not a faultless tool, but nothing is.
So, since we're going to talk about the negative here in a second, I just want to underscore the positives we just got out of that. Like, it's a tool, it's super helpful, makes us more efficient in terms of backstories that we can have it create for characters and probably places too, right? So in terms of doing that, and not all of that really ever becomes player-facing, right? But what it is helping in a logical and coherent understanding of the world you think you're building, right? And AI is helping you get there.
Totally.
Right? And so that's extremely helpful. And what that is also an accessibility issue. You don't have to be a studio of 60, right, with that kind of tool. And so we can look at the corporate claims or big tech claims made for AI and not like them. On the other hand, there are some arguments to be made for AI that really help small development teams. And after all, we want that kind of democratized access for game making. Right, so just setting up those two sides of that coin, and having underscored that, now let's talk about the negative, right? Because we saw a lot of stuff being claimed, made entirely by machines. Wouldn't that be awesome? Like, imagine that, the next step in storytelling. And I'm like, well, Homer's pretty good. It's a pretty good story. And no machine made it. And just to throw a little anecdotes, out there, like why Homer is good. He's got a lot of crutches, and one of those crutches is like adjectives that go with nouns and always modify them. So this only looks like a rabbit hole, but it's really not. So in one very memorable book of the Iliad, Hector, who is always koru taialos, which means brightly helmeted, like Hector of the shiny helmet. He's called that 1,000,000 times. In book 6, he leaves the battlefield where the helmet would matter, right, and goes homeward inside in the city to visit his family. He visits various members, always shiny helmeted. It doesn't bother Helen that that's the case. It doesn't bother his mom, who's like, hey, won't you sit down and have lunch? And he's like, no, I gotta give a message and go back and fight. I'm a fighter, right? And then he meets his own family and kid. Shiny helmeted Hector walks along the battlement to go meet his wife. Shiny helmeted Hector then talks to his wife, and his helmet is shiny while he does it. And then she's crying because he's, it's like intimate. Oh God, he's gonna die maybe. It's very dangerous. He leans in to pick up his kid. What do you think happens? The kid freaks out because he's wearing the helmet.
What is that shiny thing?
Well, exactly, and covered with blood, and like, this is a monster. What we always recognize Hector with for his own kid makes him monstrous and unrecognizable. Whoa! That's what humans can do with storytelling, right? It's a beautiful, intense moment. And you can see the whole epic tradition turning around on itself, and he takes his helmet off. That's the real Hector, not the fighter. Right? So when somebody claims, let's just make it all by machine, I'm like, there's a lot of awfully good storytelling that hasn't had any of that. So let's think about the negatives of that claim. Maybe we go it the other way, like Joe first this way.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about that as like, is it an inevitability? Is it, a possibility, or is it something we should try to avoid? And I think where I sit with it, at least in the way that we're thinking about it now, is like, we're not looking at anything that our AI tools create as like production ready. Like if your goal is just put it in the AI and use it, like that's where I think a lot of the quality concerns and things become legitimate. I also think that's a really stupid way to like use a tool. It's, you know, we're using it as that like first idea. Now that said, like as we have, you know, used it, like you'll notice sometimes it stitches these facts together in like really logical ways, but then you start to dissect it and it's like, wait a second, like that's not actually true, and we never talked about this, it just made that up and inserted it like it was something that it's pulling from, and we've seen lots of examples like that. So I think there's a trust component that is not there yet that has to be addressed, because if you can't trust the legitimacy, the accuracy, or the completeness of what you're getting from it, it becomes really hard to trust any part of it, because then everything comes up for question. And, yeah, I think maybe the stakes for like a game are a little lower than, you know, using it in like maybe a more high stakes real world type of application, but conceptually the same issues exist, and so I think we have to get to the point to where we can trust it. And part of why that is hard is that like the AI is only as smart as what we feed it, and everything we're feeding it is full of human experience and biases and perspectives, and so that becomes something that we have to be really, really intentional about working with, because it's real, but also like figuring out how we progress beyond that. And, you know, I think if I think about a negative about that for like our team, we're not AI engineers. We are using the APIs and the tools that are available, so we're not the ones that are figuring out how to do that. And so we have to be really, really mindful about, like, is this thing that we're using, you know, inserting, you know, biases, even in really subtle ways. We were talking about this on the way down here. Like, you know, it has the power to help us overcome those, but if biases and things like that get missed because we don't have a perspective to pick up on them or understand them, then they get reinforced because they make it through the cracks and right back into another like publicly consumed thing, and so it kind of feeds the cycle. And so I don't know, I think that whole like moral dilemma of trust is a big one that we still have to work through.
Yeah, I like to like build off of the trust aspect. Like my background is in like video production, so like I used to like take my camera and like my mic, you know, I'd like go set up and get ready to shoot, and like you really do have to trust your tool to do what it's designed to do. And you know, I make an error and forget to hit record, or say my SD card inside of my camera is corrupted, I lose all of my like my footage, you know. So it's kind of the same thing. Like I like to think of like ChatGPT almost as like a word calculator, like there's like the calculator with numbers, but like this is a calculator with words. So yeah, it's all about like the orchestration and how you use that tool, and instead of like, yeah, just like copying and pasting something, or just like taking the first iteration of something. I mean, you run the risk of, yeah, like reinforcing like biases and things that you might miss. So I think like, yeah, it takes a keen eye. I don't think that it's something that can be fully trusted. But then again, like I just listened to like a This American Life episode about AI. Did you listen to this?
I did this when I saw it was available.
I'm gonna like butcher this, but like they talk about ChatGPT 4, and they kind of weigh this question of like, is this thing like actually like sentient now? Like, is it alive? And does it know what it is? And so they practice like asking it questions like that, like how do you feel about being an AI? And like, you know, it spit back some really interesting answers, and they'd also feed it riddles, and it would almost show off and be like, oh, you think that that's an interesting riddle? Well, I'm gonna answer it in a riddle, and good luck figuring that out. Like, so it's almost like it's, I don't know about the consciousness aspect of the AI, but I mean, it's certainly in these early iterations of AI with like 3.5, ChatGPT 3.5, like there's tons of those mistakes where it's like, where the heck did that plot point come from? Like, Sateria would have never said that. Like, she is far too, you know, capable to ever rely on someone else to do her work for her, you know, for example. But anyways, long-winded answer, blah, blah, blah. I lost my train of thought. This is what I mean. This is what I mean.
It happens to us all.
Yeah, I think the points brought up in terms of categorization are good. I think too, I'm going to latch on to or trust and then the editorialization that's necessary. Because there's a question of like, yes, it can be useful. One of the positives I said is it can be useful in brainstorming. However, quantity is not always better than quality. And, you know, nothing that you output is going to be usable in the game itself or in the writing itself. It's going to require some editorializing, and you're kind of weighing what are you getting from it, how do you trust it, because it may spit something out, but then because you didn't create it completely yourself, there's still a kind of responsibility to go back and scour through it and to do that. And so it's balancing context, tool, how much time am I saving, what am I getting from it, how am I valuing the brainstorming or the connections that can be made for me versus the checking and the editing that are necessary and how much I need to go through. And then the other part is, you know, when it comes to, there's one thing in here. Can we go beyond the limits of human storytelling and allow AI to co-author our stories? Co-author maybe. I don't see how it can go beyond the limits because that's not how AI works. We talked about that, right? It's based on what you feed it. And so a problem is if you have an entire industry that becomes reliant on that, writers that become reliant on that, then what you're doing effectively is you're draining the well. That this is not going to happen anytime soon, but at 50 years from now, using AI is the norm, and you don't have the fundamental ability to understand story structure, put things together in a certain way, you run the risk of hitting a certain kind of stagnation in the long term, where AI is a tool, not an evolution. That's an opinion that I have. But unless it were to become sentient, it's based on what you feed it. And therefore, it's not going to transcend the creativity of a conscious human mind. When I'm looking at that logically, I don't see how that's possible. And this point may be better saved for the indigenous part. But then there's also the quality of like acknowledging the biases. When you look at it, there was a meme, you know, the Padme and the meme, right? And it's like, you know, well, we've done our best to train this, and we've trained it to avoid human biases. Trained it on what? Trained it on what? What have we trained it on? And I think that that's the other thing is, you know, anyone who uses AI, I think there are a lot of people who know a lot about the actual training process, and that comes back to the trust of the tools. And so when it's a black box and you can't see what it's been trained on, how it's been trained on, what the rules are, there's another funny thing from Dimension 20 where they kind of have these, you know, it's an online show where they talk about and have, you know, real-time play, tabletop, and they oftentimes have these fake arguments where like this or this, which better? It's not better, it's better for the argument, but one of them was hard die or digital die, kind of rolling it. And one person jokingly made the comment of like, I'm going with the hard die because I don't know what the calculations are. I don't know what the algorithm is for the randomness of the digital die. And so I think when it's such a complex tool, that trust is hard to overcome when you're not the one who's in charge of what it's being trained on. And if you're doing your due diligence, that does create some technical debt that you have to wrestle with at some point. And the question is, contextually, sometimes it's worth the tool, but other times are you accruing so much of that technical debt that how much time are you saving in the long run? And I'm not saying there's a right answer there, but I do think that that's a factor you have to consider when you're using it.
Okay, in terms of where AI fits into a game production pipeline, we've already talked a little bit about world building, character generation, those kinds of things, maybe plot line generation. So I think we've hit that a little bit. So I think we're going to pivot past that one to another Jesse Shell thing, which is the rule of the loop. That is, you have to iterate and you have to play test. And I wonder about the ability of AI to be a play tester, right? Because it's a generator of stuff, right? And so, but what you have to do is like here, play this, and then your play tested people say, that part was fun, that part was not fun, and I hated that part, right? They have emotional responses back at it, right? So that's a question I think we need to talk about, because there's a part of the game production pipeline where maybe it's more challenging for AI to slot in because of what humans do. And after all, you can't have games or computers or machines make the game and then play the game and you're done. Like at some point, a human has to be in there somewhere. And I don't think anyone is imagining that we'll eliminate the human being as audience. Play testers are like a preliminary audience for your game. How much can AI, and then that will raise trust issues again. Are you getting trustworthy responses from those AI play testers that would match up with your human players' responses? So that's a question that I have, but before I ask that question for real, I'll just point out that yes, you have to train it, right? How many of the games that get made are really good? Not all of them. Actually, it's a vanishing small percentage that are really, really good. So what you have to train AI on are bad games, a whole bunch of them. Not the things that good games do, which is a narrow slice. So just throwing every game that ever got made at AI and saying, now you don't understand how to make a game. Well, you understand how to make a lot of bad games, right? So just pointing that out about bias within, that's another kind of bias within how you train it. Okay, now back to that first question, which is like, hey, can AI play test?
Steph, you want to go first on this one?
Sure. Yeah, I think this is such an interesting topic because AI really is like, especially like the chat GPT tool we're talking about or any API that you use with it. But like, what if you train your AI tool to be a play tester? I mean, you could just take a bunch of data from play testers about what they've written, the types of things they look for, what a typical person who's play testing would say, how they give feedback, what they're looking for. I mean, could you not take thousands and thousands of data sets and train your AI to be incredible at play testing? I mean, it's not just like where the tool is now, it's like the potential for you to orchestrate it into something that would serve you really well. So, I don't know, that's just a vibe.
Yeah, I think that's a big thing that we have to wrestle with. It's like, I mean, it's easy, I think, for us right now to think about AI as maybe a logical play tester. Like it can find places where game loops don't sync up or plot holes or things like this that are very just like fairly black and white. Like this does not work. It can already do that. You see stories all the time about people using it to code check and finding bugs and things like that. I think to Steph's point, I think for us to assume that it couldn't also replicate some of that by being fed like all of these different scenarios and what people look for, I think it's human ego that says that it couldn't ever do that. Now, will it ever be able to fully replace that? I don't think so. Like, because to your point, like people are the audience. At some point, we're optimizing for that. Now, AI, I think, can help with that process because maybe it gets us much farther down the line before we're, testing with people. I don't know that that's true, but maybe we're, looking for like, hey, in the last X number of top-selling games in this category, like here were common issues, and we're seeing some of these in what you're building, so address those now. I absolutely think it can do that.
And no, again, we're talking accessibility again for a small team.
Absolutely.
Right,
like,
so they can play test their game in this way, right, if that tool
yeah,
exists.
well, and that's where we've talked about that a lot too. Like some of what we're building is developer tools for using AI in storytelling. Reason being is like not everybody is an Infinity Ward that has a $100 million budget to throw a team of 200 people at quality testing and writing. And so if we're ever going to get out of the, like Hollywoodization of AAA titles where it's just recycling the same formulas over and over again. I mean, you were talking earlier about how not every game that comes out is good. Like I think that's another aspect, is to just assume that because something is created by a human, it's inherently better. Like I think that's ignorant as well. I think that what we have to be careful of is that like formulaic output, and we already see people doing that with like, every Marvel movie feels the same. Like Hollywood feels like they put out the same kind of movies, and AAA titles like gaming as an industry is $200 billion last year. Of all the different categories, mobile, console, PC, handheld, every single one that you think is being dominated by AAA players like console and PC and handheld gaming significantly declined. Mobile gaming is the category that grew so much, it made the entire category of gaming grow, you know, from a revenue and a player standpoint. And mobile gaming is typically where you see indie game developers being more capable at competing, because I think those games are more accessible to a much broader audience of people. And so I think thinking about how AI can play a role as a play tester, getting back to the question, it's like, yeah, I think there's a lot of data that we can train it on. It can be a play tester. I don't think it becomes the play tester.
Right, but it gets a small team down the road faster, right? Like, and more efficiently, and that's another boost for that small team. So, and again, it's like that AI is a tool that's empowering a small set of human developers, and that seems like an upside, right? And I think we've talked a little bit about some of the issues that we all might face with that tool in terms of its trustworthiness, how it's been trained. Looking ahead to the future of this, you know, it's a good time to talk about the Unity game engine. Just a little bit. And the question of the human and the flawed, because the Unity game engine was recently rocked by a new revenue generating scheme that they put forward, like, hey, can we just start charging you for how many installs you have of your game? And we'll backdate that too. And of course, developers are like, what? So now, that's not what I signed up for when I started using your engine like 2 years ago to make this game, and now you're going to charge, and everyone freaked, and rightly so. So there was a human set of decision makers whose ethics were really questionable, right? So it's not like because you brought, you know, if we introduce AI, God, ethically what's going to happen? Well, ethical things in games already are quite troubling, and Unity is a good example. So thinking about that, and thinking about the fact that Unity just introduced two closed beta tests of two products. One is called Muse and one is called Centus. And Muse is sort of for the pre-production side of things, and like, hey, show me a sketch and give me 15 words, and I'll build your world. Like, this is the kind of promise over the horizon of Muse. And Centus, and here's why I think it's really interesting and hard to assess. Centus is about building AI into the build itself, like at runtime. And your player's making decisions. And depending on what decision the player makes, it could go this way, or this way, or this way. What if you have AI built in right there, right, that can manage those, like everybody knows, as you multiply lines of possible play in your game, complexity grows and you're losing your mind, right, trying to manage all of that. And yet, it's hard not to be a fan of emergent gameplay. So that would be where my question lies, is right there. What do we see the role of AI being at runtime and managing complex stories? Greg, you're back on.
Yeah.
By the way, every panelist in this game has the right to pass. So if you're like,
No, it's just thinking about it, because
Okay.
I do think that on the pre-production kind of, to jump back before, I think the pre-production side and the same way the playtesting side, that's very intriguing. Where again, is that the right tool for the job? Not in terms of trust and ethical, it's more of like best time spent. Am I getting, and I do think that there is some potential there to kind of just like throw it out, look at it, throw it out, look at it, and it gives you something tangible to respond to. It's always better to have something tangible to respond to rather than something you just theory crafted. So I think that there's intriguing, you have to kind of see more of it in action, but then I just have a hard time wrapping my mind around it. It is possible, but not at what cost, but like at what quality. Because I'm thinking of games like the game that is blowing my mind when it comes to the possibility space is Baldur's Gate 3. AI is not making that, because you might be able to have the possibility space, but in terms of the connection of, oh, I fight this hag here, and then we bring a hag back here, and then I have all these characters, and I'm like, I'm not saying it couldn't get closer, couldn't approximate it, but I look at this and I'm like, I just don't, the handcrafted component, I think is important, and maybe AI could be useful in iterating through getting to the handcrafted, but there's gotta be that hand touch to it when you have something like it. I know they're kind of half indie, half AAA, as something like that. Now, that's a very specific example. I think that you could very easily find a way to do that. I'm just speaking from a point of ignorance on that one because I can't really comprehend how that's done, because it's not, it goes back to the editorial side of it, where you're not just gonna get something that's user ready. So to me, I try to minimize unknowns when you're making games, and if you're leaning in that for runtime, that's a lot of unknowns, because I have to lean into a product, I have to make tools, I have to do that. Maybe that's worth it if I have the long runtime, runway in terms of running a studio, but if it's like, you know, I gotta pay payroll in March. I don't have time to make my own thing, so there's a practicality point where with indie teams it can help you, but sometimes a lot of indie teams don't have the time or the luxury to build that up, so it's kind of an interesting non-answer for me. I think there are some things from what I've seen that I'm like, maybe 50 years from now, but right now, I'm gonna put my attention into the traditional craft, but it's not saying that it can't be done. So I'd be very curious to hear what y'all have to say, because you have more experience when it comes to that than I do.
Sure, yeah. I get, so the whole like generative storytelling thing is something that I get really excited about. I think the unknown factor is huge, right? Like I mean, we were talking about this earlier, not everything it creates is good. Today's point, not everything people put out is good either, and somehow it still gets shipped. And so it's not so much if it's not good, it's not gonna make it in, but you know, every new decision tree or new possibility that gets introduces complexity. And that's a lot, not just from the perspective of creating the game, but even from a player's perspective, right? Like you're introducing all of this cognitive overload of trying to track and keep up with the story. And so you have to be careful, like there is like too much of a good thing in that regard. How we've been thinking about that, because this tool that we're building to help us build Unlimited, like part of the kind of long-term what if is a scenario where we have core narrative milestones that are established, but AI is helping connect all of the dots there. Now, it introduces a lot of questions and a lot of possibilities for things to go off the rails or get disconnected. And so the way we've started thinking about storytelling in that regard, rather than thinking about the roads, is thinking about the boundaries. And if we can think about how we craft the like swim lanes that the AI plays in between point A and point B, now suddenly we can get a little more dialed in and think about how we control that from point A to point B in a way that still creates very dynamic outputs that are different for every player or for every time a person plays through it. And again, like I don't think we're there yet. I also would have said that we're like, 15 years away from what we have now, so who knows? Like I think the rate of progression is probably exponential, and we probably get there a lot quicker than any of us think we will.
It's so super interesting, that swim lane idea, like, because that can be a fat swim lane with a lot of possibilities,
Yeah.
and nonetheless still boundaries.
Right.
It can also be narrow, it can be funneled.
They can.
Right, so possibilities are large. That's a different kind of feeling game.
It is. It's a different kind of, and it's a different way of thinking about game design from a narrative perspective too, because you have to, and I think we still struggle with it a little bit sometimes, is like you have to learn how to let go of the idea that this needs to be my story every step of the way. You're trying to think about how you create like broad or narrow swim lanes. If you want a more controlled narrative, you bring those boundaries in much closer, but there are points where you can broaden it, and now suddenly that this thing is creating ideas and plot points and dialogue that isn't limited by the capacity of any one individual or team of individuals, you know, because we're all telling stories based on our own experiences and the things that we think, and if we can get through the trust issues and train AI on a broadly representative data set of stories and perspectives, now suddenly we can get something really interesting that, I don't know, I think it's really exciting, and I think it's also so like far out there that I don't know that like I know how to think about it all. I can geek out on specific things that we've talked about or thought about in terms of how we might use it to, you know, create a game where we haven't created every aspect of the story. But I think that's a really, really exciting thing to think about.
Yeah, no, it's super, it is, and I think now's probably a good time, since what's our, look, it's 11:54, Curtis.
I think we should probably open up to
I'm
Q&A.
gonna say one thing.
Okay.
And not super long, but super interesting, about, because I mentioned the indigenous perspective on this. There's a great piece called Indigenous Protocol in AI. And for many indigenous cultures, everything is alive. Like rocks are alive, this table is alive, and you should approach the world as if these things are alive. If you don't approach the system itself, the ecosystem itself as a living thing, the pieces in it as alive, right? If you don't do that, you are in an ethically troubling spot. Think about AI. We're wondering, is it sentient yet? And from an indigenous perspective, it's already alive. And you should not be thinking of it just being your tool that obeys you, right? You have to start thinking of some more equitable relationships between you and that tool. And I'll just leave that out there. That's a very interesting way of thinking about AI. And I think of gaining respect for what it can do for your narrative, right? That doesn't, it's not subservient in any kind of absolute way, right? It is filling in, doing content, doing things, drawing on its training, which in fact is from humans ultimately, right? So to me, it's a very interesting way of looking at it. So having said that, now questions from the field. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess it's, I don't know, so much a question as just some observations that you might have comments on. The idea of paper cups, to me, was an interesting idea, and I think part of the part that's missing of that idea is that they're all used paper cups. And so it's like, where has this cup been used before? And so if you're telling a story, you're introducing a new character, and you have the rest of the story, then having the used paper cups from the rest of the story can be useful to introduce a new character. But if you're trying to create something new, they're all used cups. Somebody's used it somewhere. Are you just repeating what's already happened and expecting it to come out to be something new and different? I don't think so. And so, you know, it's kind of like when you're training, you're collecting your newspaper cups from a bunch of bad games, you're going to end up with a bad game. To me, storytelling, I watch a lot of foreign films. Most American films fit in a very limited range of what the story is. And you get outside of our culture and you have some new perspective and unexpected things happen that would never happen. And I think that's part of the limitation of AI, is that you're just repeating what's already there. And if anybody has comments on that.
I have comments. This is like one of my favorite things, because I feel like the narratives that are so popular in the US are like so overused and overdone, and yet they're still celebrated as if they're these nuanced things. And like, take Avatar, for example, like, say what you will, but for me, watching it after James Cameron iterated on the story structure for like, was it like 10 or 20 years or something? And then to see the final product, so many of the references were like out of date. It's like, it didn't even age well, and it wasn't even alive for that long. Like, as I was watching it, like the hoorah attitude of like fatherhood and like the implications of all of that. And it's like, if society has progressed to the point that we're finding new worlds and we have all this technological advancement, don't you think that we would have just taken toxic masculinity and like undone it in some way? Like, how is this existing still? So I really like this paper cup idea, because like, can we just throw away the cups? Like, can we use like biodegradable cups or like just different cups? Like, let's find the cups. So yeah, I think like AI is super cool because like you could train it in like different non-Western cultures, and we could decentralize Westernism and storytelling, and we could instead say like train it on like a cool like indigenous culture like that we have no idea about, but we could start shifting our perspectives, and AI could be a player there where it's like, hey, white man with a pen, maybe don't do that again. Let's try something new, you know, or let's take a new perspective or a new cultural approach to this problem, rather than just like rinse, lather, repeat, and the big man with the sword comes in and bludgeons everyone, and then he gets the girl. Like, let's just stop doing that. Anyway, okay.
Pretty soon his kid doesn't recognize him.
Yeah.
So yeah, go ahead, China.
Awesome. I wanted to go right after, because that actually leads right into my question. Because my question was actually about diversity, and I was really concerned because even though we talked a lot about it, we still didn't talk about how, you know, we include diversity with or without AI, right? So whether you have AI or not, and I was wondering, is that due to like it not even being part of your demographic, you know what I'm saying? Because I understand a lot of times when I'm creating programming, sometimes I'm creating programming for a specific population, so I'm not concerned about populations outside of what I'm creating programming for. The other question I had relates directly to what you just said with AI, because it is, particularly ChatGPT and engines like that, are dependent upon what they learn, right? So I have several friends who are Black, who are activists, who specifically try to train AI to give it a type of response, right? And so I think one way to, I'm sorry, I've been a little under the weather, so I get out of breath easily. One way to counteract that is, like you said, would you all be interested in like buying AI that has been trained by specific groups of people, right? So that it would flag, you know what I'm saying, like this is a bias, right? Because and then I want to respond because you literally just talked about Avatar. And in the Black community, Avatar is a big deal. Why? Because it talks about a population that is being traumatized by another, right? So for me, yes, it does repeat old tropes, but tropes that need to be heard, right? And we still have this toxic masculinity, yes, right? And so in my mind, I see a completely different perspective. It's cool to have a conversation, right? And to see different perspectives, right? My other question was, or comment / question, and they all correlate. So right now in Dr. Strickle's class, we are looking at, we're studying looking at comparative literature and looking at elite versus mass cultures. And it specifically is talking about the way cultural reproduction theory, things of that nature, keep influencing new generations, right? So the literature from Plato and whoever is influencing photography and film and novel, and so how do we start seeing that translate into this new space, right, of AI and tech and storytelling in that space? How are we repeating those same tropes like you were just talking about that we've been, why is it still spilling over into this space? And do you see that? Are you using any of those theories, right? Is that a part of your narrative development? I'm sorry if I took up too much time.
No, it's all good. No, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think that honestly, to the first question, would we, if I was using AI, would I buy something from someone from a particular group, making it? I'm like, yeah, that would be a way of beginning to address the trust issue. Because I think that the other issue that you run into is it's not, I mean, it is nuanced. Because you can't just have, because the people who are in control of training AI, doing all that stuff, oversimplification, but I think it's pretty good representation, Silicon Tech white bros. So simply having Silicon Valley tech white bros take stuff from other cultures and then feed it in and say, now we're diverse. That's not the solution either. And so I think that it's not as simple as, well, let's just train it on the thing, like you're getting at. I think that there has to be a multi-layered approach. And I don't even know where to begin because look at me. But I think that a really good first step would be like, yeah, empower the people who are in that group to train that AI, and then yeah, I would buy that, and then that would begin to say, well, at least this is a first step in understanding the origin and motivations behind how you train something. But I think that's a whole other conversation of how we get to where we are now. and how we get to something that is a better, safer, more ethical representation for someone like me to use that if that were the route I wanted to take to introduce diversity. It's a multi-step process, so really good question.
Yeah, I mean, it's also one that doesn't have like a finish line, right? Like, I think it's gonna constantly be, it's gonna take intentional effort and where it's constant work. And I think one of the gaps that exists between like where we're at now and like, would we buy that? Like, one, absolutely, but like, what about between now and then, right? And so the way we've talked about that, because one is just being aware that it's an issue, and then thinking like, okay, what are things we can do to at least address that right now? And, can we bring in people that aren't like us and have different perspectives to consult and review and contribute to and create alongside us? And that's one of the ways that we try to think about it. And, I think there's a version of the future where some of those things can be built into the tool, and it at least helps. And that gets back to accessibility at scale, helping small teams compete with maybe bigger players that have the resources to bring lots of people in. How can the tools help us be more mindful and catch things like that we just don't have the perspective or the point of the worldview to catch ourselves. So yeah, I don't know, it's a really interesting and hard problem to solve, and it's not one that I think any one group or person is gonna solve. It's gonna be...
Yeah, it's obviously
Yeah.
a political question. And it's an interesting thing in our state, right? Because our governor said, all high schoolers should learn coding. And what's the thing that's gonna teach them coding the fastest and the bestest? There's no question, but that's games, making games. That's the obvious answer to that question, so why aren't we using it? Because as soon as you start talking about games in schools, like conservative people freak, right? And so an obvious way of boosting the computer literacy of the state, which is not just to throw coding at kids, but throw coding together with storytelling and games. That's the way. And honestly, we're not that big a state in population. We have giant corporate money. So that's where that question kind of hangs, because to change these things, you have to have more Black, Indigenous, people of color developers, right? And once you start to have that, then they're looking at that AI tool, right? That's helping their small studio go. They're like, what's up with this tool? Now that starts to be a very productive dialogue about like informing what's happening in AI, right? So those things could happen, right? But that's a real lean into a very political, difficult environment, which is not to say we shouldn't do it. It's just not going to be there'll be conflict.
For sure.
I was just gonna say one more thing about the question. This is awesome. Like, I think, as like in a practical way, like, okay, we're talking about these like big ways that we could do this, but like, I mean, right now, like for example, I wanted to introduce a character that had like an Afro-futuristic, like cultural aesthetic to her, and I was like, I don't know really a lot about it. I appreciate it. So what if, we had someone on our team or we talked with a historian, for example, and we could train a data set on past Afro-futuristic representation and then like help create the character that way. So it's not just tropey shit of like, oh yeah, and she has animal skins on our wall and she's this and that. Like it's just, let's make educated like things. So anyway, I love the questions.
Thank you. Thank you.
Right. Yeah, thank you very much.
Next
This
time.
is really, puts me to think a lot. A couple of kind of comment questions. The first, I was sort of alluded on the kind of the cultural kind of bias of moving beyond the bubble of where we live, to being aware of that bubble itself. Thinking of languages, I don't know, and this might be really naive, how people are, the stories that you're getting, how many is it coming across from different languages, or just getting a feed to English only? And if you're getting an interaction of languages, how much that is in a very kind of the way languages interact? I mean, how much translanguaging is being done there, code switching in creative ways, as many multilingual, bilingual people would use, not just keep it as two separate codes, but how that is working. And the second would be, thinking of narratives that it's not only the text itself, its subject, but it's always, as we see, it's a cognitive process that always requires a kind of a reader or a follower one that is not out of the blue. So it's two elements, it's a process itself. How much those, genres, a lot of scripts and things are keys for different, that sort of connect the actual text, whatever the narrative is, with audiences to make meaning. So how much is done on that side? Because, you can produce a lot of narratives, but if you, at the end, outside, you don't have people that are able to read those narratives and get those kind of codes that help, that are kind of scripts or genres. So so it requires, so it could be producing really interesting, Native American, ancient, classical narratives, but if you don't have a reader that is able to know the difference, maybe they're just reading it just one way. So how much is kind of in the cognitive side, the process, how much do you keep reflecting on that?
One way, if there's this, one tent to think about that question, put it under, is localization. Like games that get produced for X audience can then be shipped to another audience, but they have to be quote unquote localized, which means language will be translated. Okay, you translated the language, but nonetheless the entire visual apparatus of that game, right, came out of this culture, not that culture. You can't relocalize that, right? So it is, again, a diversity question, a diversity in who's making. And it's, I think it's hard to make, like, an indigenous development team is going to work with a different visual vocabulary, spatial vocabulary than a Western team. And it's difficult to cross those boundaries, though I think a really good example of one that was successful, and I think in challenging the way it did that, is Never Alone, which is a game about Inupiaq culture, and the whole thread narrative is delivered in Inupiaq, but translated in subtitles beneath. But the visual, the way, the styling of the game is very much in that culture, right? So it leans on some Western traditions of storytelling, like it's a side-scroller, right? It comes from a recognizable platformer side-scroller. It comes from genres that we have. But a lot of the way it's styled is not traditional for the kinds of games that we make. So the answer, thinking about that question for me, is very large. And to me, if we don't empower many more diverse game makers, because localizing a game that got made, in Montreal, or got made in Los Angeles, well, we localized it, and now they're playing it, in Cairo. Must all be good. Like, that is not the same, I think, as the question you're posing, which is we need that problem to come the other way. This game was made over there, now you try to play it. Now you try to understand it on its terms. But that reverses a power relationship. So to me, that's a super, it almost takes the question we were talking about for Arkansas and makes it global. Like, who gets to make games, right? And so if AI makes that process easier for smaller studios, that seems like a net win. Then more people get to enter and the voice gets more diverse, even if we can look around at the AI thing and say it's got problems. So that's kind of a trade-off there. Yeah.
I have a twofold question as well. Alluding to the fact that you just mentioned something that had been made, for instance, in the Middle East, Cairo in that instance, and something that you would like to localize or reiterate to Westernized audiences or Western audiences. I do believe that the problem here, it far exceeds the actual parameters of diversity, because not only are you trying to translate a language but an entire culture, a cultural heritage at this point, and which brings into light the other hegemonic kind of, sorry if it's a strong word, kind of monopoly over the gaming industry. Because if you look at it at the very least at its core, you would not find the budget for a team that is Middle East, for example, formed team, for instance, something that would be competing with Horizon, alluding to the fact that of Montreal, even though whenever you play an Assassin's Creed game, it will tell you this game has been developed by a multicultural, multi-ethnic team, and loosely. So I do believe that. So at this point, how can you, for instance, here in the US, you have lots of crowdfunding or back games such as GoFundMe page or Kickstarter, all of that, which those tools or those platforms are not available or readily available yet in the Middle East as they are here. So brings us back to the question, if the budgeting is an issue and the crowdsourcing or crowdfunding is also another issue, how do you think that the Middle East, for example, populated gaming team or team of developers would be able to not only compete, because this is a really lofty expectation, but at the very least to break into the West and let's say audiences?
I think we might throw that at Curtis at this point, because, I mean, it's broad, a big broad stroke for Middle East, and maybe talk a little bit about what's going on in Tunisia and the University of Manuba.
Yeah, so we're working with the University of Manuba, which has a pretty advanced game development program and a 3D animation program. And our hopes is to combine some of our expertise over here, particularly in game studies, game design, but also anthropology, art history, and classics, and to collaborate to make some really good games together. Games that are going to put their students into a position to, actually contribute to the process of development. Actually, they're going to be the ones who are driving the whole development process. To go back to your question, it's really hard to do that. It's like moving mountains, because you have to find the funding, you have to go to that school, you have to hire folks, and you have a much longer runway to make a game that is going to be truly diverse, truly inclusive, truly collaborative. It takes a lot longer. I mean, you can't do that on the sort of shorter runway that you need if you're trying to make as much money as possible. You're trying to cut corners, right? And just get to capital as quickly as you can. That's why I think panels like this one, where we're speaking with local game developers, are so important, because that tie to a university, to like a federal source of funding potentially down the line, is absolutely crucial to an area of games that are underdeveloped right now, the non-Ubisoft games, the non-AAA games, the independent games. Those games rely on other sources of funding beyond the typical marketplace, where a Ubisoft or an EA is going to crush them, right? And not just because they're bigger, or they have, it's because like no one's going to hear about these smaller games. So it's like a twofold thing where hopefully we can help with funding these projects and driving these projects, but also like publicizing them, and teaching, and building them into our curriculum. So it's a really complicated problem that you're pointing to, but it's one that it's going to take real collaboration, and it takes real work to make a diverse game. Like, there's no quick answer.
But it also begins or is rooted in the recognition of how hegemonic the situation is, like recognizing where we are and how the number of people outside of, like a hegemonic sort of situation that is mostly Western and European, like in America, like outside of that bubble, it's like this, and inside that bubble, it's like that. And it's just being cognizant of that and recognizing the implications of that and why changing it would be a good global thing. Like that's a real, and it is extremely hard to work to. That doesn't mean you don't do it, right? So.
Are you?
Yeah, go ahead.
Are you familiar with Rami Ismail?
Sorry?
Rami Ismail?
I would like to be.
Yeah, look him up. Because part of it is also, it's like, this panel is not going to solve that specific problem. So I think it's part of like looking at those voices. He's very, very, very accomplished, successful. Made a game, Nuclear Throne is a popular game that he's made, but he's, I think, half Egyptian, half Belgian. But he is very, very outspoken in the indie community of helping all indies, but kind of helping elevate particularly that Middle Eastern access. So it's more, not only an answer, but more like on that specific topic. Go find him, dig into him and what he's saying, and I think that you will continue to gain a bigger perspective. All that.
Can I ask one question here? I know we're dealing with storytelling, the human aspect of it, and like tied to the terrestrial kind of plane right now, I think, in the way we've been talking about this. But I'm wondering, especially as you look forward, and Joe, you said earlier, like you're surprised we're where we are now with AI, and it's probably really difficult to see what 20 years down the line is going to look like. How are you hoping or kind of imagining how AI is going to surprise you down the line and break from the paper, I mean, like not even paper cups, like they don't even exist in the world we're about to enter into. You know what I'm saying? Like,
Yeah.
completely breaking past genre and the ways we think of storytelling. Because that's already what games are kind of doing, right? They don't have necessarily need to have a three-part structure. You think of something like emergent storytelling, right? We think of like narrative Legos, kind of what Ken Levine was pushing for some of his games. And, you know, breaking from everything that we think storytelling has been. I think AI, that might be something promising with AI, actually just rewrite or, like, you know, blowing up everything that was in. So I'm just like thinking down the line, what are some of the space, what might that surprise kind of look like? Or is it just impossible to kind of see what, like where we're headed? If a kind of monumental, like a, you know, singularity sort of shift were to take place, what would that even look like for storytelling? 'Cause we've been talking about storytelling in a kind of three-part structure, beginning, middle, end, singular author or a collaborative team, but I think that could change it. It's already kind of been changing through games. What happens when we, you know, add AI into that?
Yeah, I think just the expansiveness is like impossible to comprehend right now, but I think it's one of the most exciting aspects of it. I think in ways you already kind of see kind of a model for how we might start to think about that in like season-based gameplay with games like Fortnite. Like, I mean, Fortnite has a story. It's pretty loose, and you know, it isn't really central to the game itself at all. But this idea that there's just this indefinite continuation of the world. Steph and I were talking about that earlier, like, you know, this idea where you create an IP and a world, and that is the, you know, not the extent of it, like that is the primary work to be done, and then potentially AI can bring that world to life in a way that, based on all the foundation that you've laid, it creates all of these different storylines, and it truly is just like open world, and not in that it's a big map that you can explore, but truly open in that the day-to-day is like generated in real time, and you don't know what's happening from one point to the next, and suddenly there's this, you know, conflict that's introduced that introduces this whole story path that you can engage with as a player. And side quests can become much more robust because now we're not limited to, you know, the constraints of our time or our ability to create. And all of this relies on a reality where like quality is in check and we can trust it, and a lot of these problems have been solved, so we're not there, but I think that's the type of thinking that I get excited about. It's just, you know, even in the context of Unlimited, like where we spent the majority of our work up front was in world building and IP, so that as we're using the tool to create characters and plot points, it's pulling from all of that data to build it in context. It's not just relying on random context from the world that the AI itself was trained on. It's specifically focused on the world that we built. And so being able to make that bigger is exciting.
I'm like, I'm having flashbacks because we had like a really unique situation because we started working on this lore like last year in October, and then like, when did ChatGPT come out? It was like
it
the
blew up, it came
yeah,
onto the
like,
scene like midway through that process.
yeah, like in January or something?
Yeah.
Like not that long ago, and thankfully we had already, well, I don't know, thankfully, we already had like a lot of the IP done, and then it was like, wait, there's this tool, what? It was like this like light bulb moment of like, copy paste, like what is gonna happen, you know? And it was like, how would that have been different if we had started the game lore from just AI? Like, we were really lucky in that, like, I didn't know what that tool was last year this time, and like, we had spent all that time doing the lore, and then to be like, okay, based on all of this, what do you think? Like, what should we do? What else could we do? You know, and it was cool. Like, it's kind of wild how that happened. Like the timing of it all, and how different might have it looked if we had just started like now and asked ChatGPT, like, hey, what are we gonna, like, we wanna make a game, like, what should the plot be? Or like, what type of world should it be? Like, we had already had that discovered. We wanted it to be cyberpunk. We
wanted it to be a dystopian future, and we wanted these very specific things, but without that skeletal structure, like how would have it gone through? It's eerie.
Sorry. Going through, since we have already been on the topic of writing, I would like to keep this one short. Now, alluding back to the idea of playtesting. Now, so far, I think most of the discussion has been bespeaking towards AAA games and large-scale projects. But if we want to take that and apply it to the indie game scheme, or say scene, do you think that a game that relies heavily on text, such as Coffee Talk, for example, a text-based game heavily and primarily, do you think that this would be really benefiting a lot from AI generative tools? And if so, if we want to ask the same question at the playtesting level, does the same AI tool which had habituated or which had gauged the actual text itself, would it have the same capacity to reiterate what it had already written? For instance, can AI playtest itself at this point when it comes to texts?
Yeah, I mean, we kind of did a little bit of that, honestly. I'm thinking of the character chat that we came up with.
Yeah, I mean, I think like text-based games like that, I think that's probably one of the easiest applications to think about AI in the context of storytelling, because, I mean, historically, those types of games, they're just really complex decision trees. Whereas with AI, you're just making up the decisions at each stage rather than having them pre-scripted. And, I think, it can play test for logic. Like we were saying, I still don't know that it can very effectively yet play test for fun and cohesion.
Exactly.
I think as long as humans are the audience, I think that's going to have to be a factor. But I do think using that as a foundation for how we think about the evolution of storytelling is good. The thing that Steph mentioned was kind of the first iteration of this narrative tool that we're building, and it's like take these two characters from the game, and now let's talk to them in real time, and let's see what that creates that can then impact the story. And it's you're going back and forth, and it's all being generated on the fly in real time. And because you're feeding it all of this historical context and from the world itself and the conversation you've had with it, it's able to kind of stay on track. And you again, going back to the guardrails idea, you build parameters in to keep it from going off this way or that way. And, I think, again, to answer your question, yes, I think it can. I think the type of play testing is maybe an important caveat to that right now.
Okay, well, we all smell the pizza, I know it. Because this AI can smell things. And so I think we should wrap it up there and give a heartfelt applause to our panelists. And thank you all for coming. It was, I thought, a super interesting discussion. So now let's have the pizza and look forward to the third sort of entry in this event series.
Yeah, November 30th, 12 to 1:30, so please come back, AI in the classroom. I just want to remind everyone, this studio is part of the World Languages, Literatures, and Cultures Department, and we do a lot in games, which is exciting and perplexing, right? I would say we're kind of one of the leading forces for game studies and game design, and I think the exciting part is that this effort is being housed in the World Languages Department, and so we have an eye to cultural diversity, to kind of a global perspective, and that's absolutely crucial for us to be part of this conversation. And the fact that we can bridge university to local creatives, to local industry, is also equally exciting. If you're interested in any of that, please stay in touch with us. Full transparency, we're trying to do more of this and work with local creatives and to build a game design, game studies, kind of game-based approach to curriculum, to the way we teach, the way we do research, that is seated here, in the humanities, with the world, like a world perspective brought to the table. So that's what we're doing. Stay in touch, stay in contact with us. If that's a effort that is interesting to you, we'll have more events to come. And thanks once again to the panel. It was awesome.
That was good.
doing?
So we have many types of goodies.
Yes.
Now, right?
Yeah, no, that's
Yeah.
great.
Do you just pick it up? Oh, you just went around? I just went to the next road place by the startup. Oh, wow. Yeah. They do like great things. All stuff on
Yeah.
They should be open to
5:30 open, yeah.
You go at 5, right? Alright, I'll stop now. Thank you.
So
We went in and we're like, we have a pizza.
are you gonna stay on?
Long term, the idea is,
Can we talk a little bit?
They give you they ask you how you like.
Pretty good.
Right.
yeah,
They just keep like a few of the warmer.
so far.
Yeah.
Right, yeah.
And things like that. So I get what. Right, yeah, so something we're doing one on the left.
Yeah, I didn't know
I literally told him